Hello? What? Put on my headset. Hello, everybody. Welcome to our training today on the robust science behind berberine for Healthspan and lifespan. Just checking. It looks like my audio is working before I get going. I'm going to try to switch to this headset. There we go. Okay. That should be a bit better. So thank you so much for joining tonight. I'll introduce myself in a second, but first, I want to introduce the moderator, Irene. So Irene, thank you so much for being here tonight, and to give you some instructions, and then I will introduce the topic. So for everybody here, my talk tonight is going to be about 45 minutes, give or take, and then I'm going to take questions at the end just to keep the flow going. So what I would like from you for chatting with one another, which is great, sharing ideas and such, please use the chat. But for asking questions to me to answer at the end, because I don't have time to go through all the chat to find the questions, please put that in the separate section, which is the Q&A. I also often get asked, is the recording going to be available? And it always is on the Healthy Planet YouTube channel. So I know that Irene is going to post those links for you. And I think that's mostly what I need to say before I get going. Okay. So my talk is on, I don't usually do a very product focused talk, but I am doing that tonight. And that's because once in a while you get a very exceptional product. I have spent years looking at different natural health products, and berberine stands out in the sense that it has really robust evidence and lots of studies, which you don't always have the advantage of with other health products. And I think it also addresses such an important underlying I'm going to say condition that's so common for people that could help with definitely our health span, us being free of many diseases and thereby lifespan as well. So I wanted to share it with you. My name is Talia Charney, and I'm the Nutrition and Health Education Manager for Now Foods Canada, a holistic nutritionist and wellness coach. I've been in the health industry for well over 30 years. Seen clients for many years. I've written books. I did start out in the fitness area and as a personal trainer, but then moved on to a lot of other things. And I have a lot of training that already done on the Healthy Planet website that you can go and look at if you just enter my name. These are my training values, which I always like to highlight. They are important to me: honesty, objectivity, nuance always, and humility, because as much as we know, there's so much that we don't know in this world of science. So I always sometimes say, like, take everything with a grain of salt when it comes to science, but especially around food and nutrition. And this is a quick introduction to the Now family. It's a 56-year-old family-owned company. This is the founder, Elwood Richard, who was a scientist, and his children and the 4 generations of the great-grandchildren are now owners in the company. You can read about it. It's quite a fascinating story. If you're interested, on the Now Foods website, there's a book written by his son, Dan. And if you're ever in the area of Guelph, well, that's where over 70% of the Now Canada portfolio is produced and packaged. And I'm in downtown Toronto, in case you're curious. This is one tidbit of interesting information I always like to say, because it's quite spectacular, is we perform 31,000 quality tests every month. An obligatory disclaimer. Sorry, I have to read through this, but it's so important, especially for consumers out there. Just to note that this presentation is for general informational purposes only, does not constitute the practice of medicine or any other healthcare professions. That means any information written or stated here or materials linked from here is at your own risk. So content of this presentation is not meant to be a substitute for professional medical advice, diagnosis, or treatment. Users should not disregard or delay in obtaining medical advice for any medical condition they may have and should seek the assistance of their healthcare professionals for any such conditions. Nevertheless, I hope that you can take some of the information here and share it with your pharmacists, your doctors and such, your naturopaths, whoever it is whose care you're under, that can help you maybe incorporate some of these things. Okay, so if we're going to talk about health span, meaning the amount of years we can go without having hopefully any frank disease develop, and lifespan as kind of a proxy for that. If you are free of disease, assume that you live longer. They sort of go hand in hand. Then we need to see like what are the most common causes of death in Canada. You probably heard worldwide, you generally hear heart disease is the #1 killer. Came up as #2 just because all the cancers are being lumped together. And there's been some, advances in intervention. So a little bit lower of the heart disease, but nevertheless, heart disease is still up there. And and cerebrovascular disease, which is really similar. These are both diseases of our blood vessels in our hearts. Sometimes it affects the brain, sometimes it affects the heart. And then we have diabetes at #7. But what's really interesting to note that for those who have diabetes or pre-diabetes or who are progressing to that, there's a strong link between what's going on in your body with diabetes and the development of heart disease, as well as cerebrovascular disease, which, by the way, is one of the main types of cerebrovascular disease is dementia. There's a strong link between that and even some of the ones lower here, Alzheimer's or chronic liver disease like fatty liver disease. And the common link between all of these, you probably heard for many years, everyone's excited about talking about inflammation. Inflammation as the underlying cause of all diseases. And one could make an argument for that being very important, but there's another one that I would say is so prevalent, and that's insulin resistance. Even in people who don't have diabetes, I would say in many people who don't have diabetes, but definitely in people that have diabetes. And so before I talk about insulin resistance, let's just get a basic review or grasp about what is insulin and what does it do. So insulin it's a hormone in our body. And when we eat food, particularly with glucose or from carbohydrates, you get an increase in insulin. So this is a signal, and that insulin goes up. And insulin really is like a conductor that tells the body in many ways, what should we do with our energy? And actually, there's not a cell in the body that doesn't have receptors for insulin. So it has very widespread influence across the body. But when you are well fed, your insulin goes up and it provides signals especially strong to your muscles, to your liver, and to your fat cells. And that signal, if working well, because we are in a fed state, is that we need to take that glucose out of circulation and use it to make energy, to burn those carbohydrates so we have energy, because we need energy in order to feed and sustain us. So that's what insulin is doing. And your muscles are particularly important as a huge sink for that glucose to go to. And that glucose is going to be burned for fuel. And what we have left over is going to be stored in your muscles and also stored in your liver as a backup of which is called glycogen. So when you need more energy, it will break down. So that's essentially what insulin does. That's hugely important. Now, this is a really great graph. I want you to pay attention to this. It's going to set the sort of the understanding of everything that's coming up, including, why am I talking about berberine? So we know there's people who have diabetes. Over here, what this graph is showing is the timeline for diabetes. And here's your blood glucose. So the blood glucose, normal, 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 and it slowly goes up. At this stage here, you are considered pre-diabetic. And once it goes up to a certain threshold that we've decided, that threshold sort of decided at the point where we're really starting to develop side effects and diseases from poorly controlled blood sugar being high. And that's usually when your doctor's going to intervene. Occasionally, they might intervene with drugs and pre-diabetes, or they might just say, watch your diet or something like that. Occasionally, you might get drug intervention at this stage, depending on your family history and your risk. But for all of these years, and this can be for a decade or even more, up to 20 years, your glucose looks normal every time you go to the doctor. But what isn't normal and what isn't being measured and what you're usually not aware of is slowly your insulin is creeping up and up and up. This it's creeping up because it is trying hard to keep your glucose down, to take it out of circulation and into your cells. And when our glucose is constantly too much, so we're getting too much energy, more than we need, or we're eating too frequently, or we're eating too many carbohydrates, or we're not taking breaks between our meals, this insulin kind of keeps trying to enhance its signal. It's like the insulin is knocking on doors when it binds to the cells, like your muscles, um, and it's getting less and less effective. It's shouting and shouting at a signal. What happens is that it keeps on creeping up. And what that means is you're becoming insulin resistant long before you have diabetes. Insulin resistance really is when your cells are not hearing the signal of insulin anymore. I like to think of it as like the story of the boy who cried wolf. People would keep running to see if there's a wolf there, and eventually, because he kept doing it, they just ignored him. So that's what your body is your cells, at least certain parts of your body, start to ignore that insulin signal. So it goes up and up and up. And as your insulin creeps up, you'll see here, so does a major risk factor for cardiovascular disease, which is your cholesterol, your different blood lipids. So the important note here is that insulin rising is not benign. It's not just going up, it actually is causing the incremental development of other diseases in the body long before you get flagged for it. Now, your doctor might start to notice your cholesterol go up and at some point put you on, statins or something. But as insulin resistance develops, so does cardiovascular disease, and the risk goes hand in hand. So what we'd like to do, and what makes sense, since it's so common, insulin resistance, is to intervene long before we get to this point, not only to prevent diabetes, but other diseases. So if we look at the statistics, approximately, now these are from 2019, that's the most recent I could find. Almost 19% of Canadian adults are at risk for diabetes. So that's going to be kind of in this stage. And about 12.4% have pre-diabetes. And if you go to your doctor every year and you get blood tests, one of those is going to be hemoglobin A1C. And that is a general indication of your average blood glucose levels over a period of 2 to 3 months. So it's more accurate than just a fasting glucose. Now, it so happens, and I will tell you, even though I'm a healthy person who's very active and who's slim, and I think I eat very well, but because of genetic factors for sure in my family, I'm already at the bottom of the at-risk category. And I can tell you my doctor did not tell me about this, nor would she, probably till I hit pre-diabetes. So I have the advantage, because I'm looking at my own blood tests, and I encourage you to do that, to start taking action now so that I don't creep up, because I know if I'm higher than I ever was, then I'm slowly developing that insulin resistance. Now, insulin resistance in this 2023 review can be correlated with many different diseases, not just cardiovascular disease. So diabetes is the obvious one everyone thinks of. Increased risk of heart disease and vascular diseases, whether it's of the brain or outside. Also, correlated to the increased risk of certain cancers, diseases of the central nervous system, of the liver. So fatty liver, pretty much everyone who has diabetes is going to have a fatty liver, kidney disease, and even issues of fertility for men or infertility for men and for women. Now, just as an aside, just to give you an example, why would increasing insulin put us at higher risk for certain cancers? Because so even though many of so our cells become resistant to insulin, your muscles become resistant to it, your fat and your liver become resistant to insulin. As your insulin creeps up and gets higher and higher, there are other cells that don't become resistant. And now the signal of insulin is much louder than it should be. And insulin, because when your insulin is high, that tells your body that you're in an overfed state. And the response of your body with insulin is always to preserve, like to hold on to energy, to hold on to your fat so you're not burning it. And it also causes things to grow. That's what insulin does, to grow, whether it's your fat, but also tumors. So what this shows here is just what happens when we have high insulin, only with regards to cardiovascular disease, but there are many other possible scenarios I could have shown. What makes our insulin go up? The number one reason why insulin resistance is so common, I would say worldwide, is overnutrition. It's not the only reason, certainly. There's all kinds of other theories, and inflammation can cause your insulin to go up, like sort of chronic low-grade inflammation, just as another example. But overnutrition, so getting more calories than the body can cope with. Your cells cannot cope with too much energy. They cannot process it. It causes oxidative stress and damage to those cells. So your body's natural reaction, if that insulin is high too much of the time, is to try to save itself from the onslaught of that overnutrition. And so you develop insulin resistance. Those cells become resistant. They don't want so much energy coming at them. They cannot deal with it. And that can lead to, the down the road, hypertension. That's a link to cardiovascular disease, to our arteries becoming thicker, and the lumen where the blood runs through, less space, so hypertension, and cardiovascular disease. And of course, if with that excess energy, and there's other reasons again for insulin resistance, such as chronic stress, but ultimately what happens for diabetes is we have this excess energy, and the insulin is chronically elevated, and it's telling your body to hold on to your fat. The fat, now we all have a different genetic ability to accumulate fat under our skin, which is sort of a safer area to accumulate it. So, but whenever we reach our personal genetic maximum, then that fat starts to spill over and go elsewhere. And we start to get more fat accumulating in our muscles, in our liver, that's fatty liver, in our pancreas. And certain types of fats that accumulate there cause disruptions in these organs so that they become insulin resistant. So our muscles don't take up that glucose readily and act as a sink to get it out of circulation. If we cannot any longer take up that sugar properly because we're insulin resistant and we don't do anything about it, we have elevated blood sugar. And elevated blood sugars have their own side effects independent of insulin. With high blood sugar, we get more oxidative stress, and we get something called AGEs. It's advanced glycation end products. It's when the circulating glucose in your body starts attaching itself to proteins and causing damage. And that explains a lot of the side effects of uncontrolled diabetes, such as vascular disease, that's all cardiovascular, kidney disease, nerve damage, and eye diseases. Now, I don't know if you've heard of insulin resistance, but what was discovered is that um, there seems to be a cluster of things that occur all at the same time in people who are insulin resistant, such as having low levels of the good cholesterol, as it's sometimes called, high levels of triglycerides and fats in our circulation, high blood pressure, high fasting glucose, and increased waist circumference. So there's this cluster of things that occurs again even before you're necessarily diagnosed with diabetes. And 1/5 of Canadian adults, by one estimate I saw here from the Metabolic Syndrome of Canada, have metabolic syndrome. And the interesting thing about these is that none of these are high enough to warrant necessarily a diagnosis or drug. So in order to meet the criteria for metabolic syndrome, you need to have 3 out of these, but the high blood pressure requirement for metabolic syndrome is just sort of pre-hypertension. It's not full hypertension, and it's just kind of high normal fasting glucose and high normal on the upper end of triglycerides. So these are things that we can notice and we can flag well before we develop the outcomes and diseases from these things. These are just good indications to know that you are insulin resistant. Dr. Peter Attia, if you've heard of him, I'm a big fan of his. He's has a well-known podcast called The Drive, and he says, and he's a very evidence-based, super smart medical doctor. He says, once you have metabolic syndrome, you're at increased risk for everything. That sounds like hyperbole, but the idea is if your insulin is chronically high and it affects literally every cell in your body, it can have deleterious effects on many different fronts. This is a sign of insulin resistance. One of them on the skin here, or both of them on the skin, but these are things you can look out for. Acanthus nigricans. Depending on your skin color and such, it may be more or less easy to see, but it definitely you can feel it and you can see it's kind of like a raised area of the skin and discoloration. And skin tags. So especially for people who have 8 or more skin tags, almost always this is an indication of insulin resistance. So for metabolic syndrome, the Obesity Society and the Endocrine Society both recognize metabolic syndrome, which again means that we have insulin resistance, not necessarily diabetes, but as clinically useful indicators of high morbidity and mortality risk, but particularly for cardiovascular disease and type 2 diabetes. So have a sip of tea here. So before, certainly that we're talking about supplements, you always want to look at what are the things you can do in your life, in your lifestyle, changes that you can make. These are absolutely core. There's no point in taking, to me, a drug or supplement without addressing these as best as you can. These are the first line therapies in Canada. So with regards to diet, and I know with diet, everyone out there is going to have their own opinion about this or that, but this is from Health Canada. Increasing fruits and vegetables, whole grains, and unsaturated fats in the diet. I would say like just the Mediterranean diet is a very good example. This would be your olive oil, reducing saturated fats, trans fats, cholesterol, and simple sugars. Yeah, if you want to ask questions at the end about some of these, glad to give my thoughts. 30 minutes of moderate intensity exercise most days, definitely. As soon as you exercise, you encourage that insulin sensitivity. For those who need to, a 7 to 10% reduction in baseline weight over 6 to 12 months. So it is very well known that weight loss can completely reverse insulin resistance or even diabetes in the early stages of diagnosis. It can have a phenomenal effect. One of the reasons for that is because fat, especially in around your organs, but also somewhat under the skin, but especially around your organs, is inflammatory. So it's part of that process of causing that chronic low-grade inflammation, which can cause insulin resistance. And insulin resistance can, in turn, cause you to put on more weight. So it's sort of like a vicious cycle. And smoking cessation, no one can argue with that. But I'd like to add a few of my own points onto that, onto what Health Canada said, and to emphasize specifically or as well resistance training, building your muscles. If your muscles are a sink for glucose, the more muscle you have, the more that glucose can be sucked up into your muscles and out of circulation. So it's doing less damage. And actually, although your muscles in part require insulin in order to take that sugar up into your muscles, you also have insulin independent doors to get those sugars into your muscles. And when you are working out, especially with weights, really working out your muscles, those doors are much more available. Those doors are all flying open. So even someone who's insulin resistant or even a type 1 diabetic, or type 2 diabetic who's on medications and is very insulin resistant, are going to benefit from exercise while being insulin resistant, are still going to be able to take up a lot of that sugar into their muscles through that pathway. Now, in order to build muscle, you need not only to work your muscles, but you also need enough protein. So in addition to just focusing on a healthy diet, to really think about protein. I take whey protein powder every day because I personally find it difficult to get enough protein in my diet. But in whatever way you can, really focus on protein. As the older we get, the harder it is to build muscle without the protein. When we're young, the body builds and grows pretty easily. It's quite sensitive to the protein. We need more and more protein as we get older. Why mental health? Because stress is actually one of the contributors to insulin resistance, and a significant one. I noticed when I wore a 24-hour glucose monitor myself, which I just did as a fun experiment, that sometimes my blood glucose would go up as if I had eaten a meal, even though I had been fasting for hours, just from my stress. When we go into the stress response, and stress is normal, but if it's kind of chronic or very frequent, your body actually raises your glucose levels in your body, because when we're stressed, we're getting a signal that we need to deal with that fight or flight, to run from the tiger. And so we need to have energy to deal with it. And so there is a release of blood glucose. Those levels will rise just from the stress. And if it's really chronic, we can go into sort of more a permanent state of insulin resistance. Recovery, so sleep. There's studies that it's well substantiated to show that even a single night of very poor sleep can send us into an state of insulin resistance the next day. And so if that's chronic as well, it can be very problematic. So, everything in our lifestyle really, if we have a good, healthy lifestyle and mental health and such, it can course correct so many things. Okay, so now we're going to get into berberine. This is a big setup for a fantastic natural product. So, what is berberine? Berberine is something we extract from plants. It's called an alkaloid, and it can come from many different plants, typically from the same family, which would include from golden seal, or in the case of the one that the Now brand makes, from Indian barberry. Whatever it is extracted from, berberine is berberine. So this is berberine, and the HCl simply means hydrochloric acid, which is what we have in our stomach that helps us to break down our proteins. We need it for digestion as well as other things. It's very normal in the stomach. The reason we have this particular berberine hydrochloric acid is because by by far, there's a lot of studies on berberine, and just about all of them, with very few exceptions, are on berberine hydrochloric acid. And the claims that Health Canada has for these are it supports glucose metabolism. I'm going to explain to you how, but it does include helping with insulin resistance, which shouldn't be a surprise. And it helps healthy blood lipid levels as well. Now, as I mentioned, when you have insulin resistance, as it creeps up, your blood lipid levels become less and less healthy, and that's a contributor to cardiovascular disease. So it deals with both of those, but it's definitely much more potent when it comes to its effects on our glucose. And just a note here, it does say consult a healthcare practitioner for use beyond 3 months. Most of the studies on berberine are on average about 3 months. Some of them are 6 months. There are even some longer studies using it for up to 2 years, but not for blood glucose tests specifically. Nevertheless, it seems quite safe, but you have to run it by your healthcare practitioner. It's not a bad idea for long-term use. Now, out in the big internet world there, it's often said that berberine is nature's Ozempic. And I know Ozempic and Ozempic-like drugs are getting a lot of attention, so I did want to speak to that. So how does Ozempic work? Ozempic is what's called a GLP-1 receptor agonist. Don't need to get into details of what that means, but essentially what it does as a GLP-1 receptor agonist is it increases insulin secretion, and that can help with, so that's why it's used for diabetes. And that's what its first use was, but now people are using it for weight loss because it does decrease appetite and quite significantly. So it can cause major weight loss and the management of diabetes. Berberine, I'm going on the best evidence we have, but by far the most robust evidence for berberine is that it works on something called the AMPK pathway, which, and I'll show you another slide on that, but the AMPK pathway is the same pathway that the most commonly prescribed drug for diabetes works on, which is called metformin. You have diabetes, I'm sure you know of it. So that's where the most robust evidence is. There's other evidence. Animal studies, cell culture studies that show it may work on other pathways. And it's possible that it works in more than one way, but definitely in a major way, more like metformin. But it may support something called PCSK9 inhibition. There are drugs called PCSK9 inhibitors used to lower cholesterol. They're injected, and they're not nearly as common as statin drugs, but they are used. This might explain the fact that berberine has shown to have modest effects on blood lipids as well. And there are also indications that it modulates gut bacteria, so it works in our gut to some extent, and to increase GLP-1 secretion. So that's kind of related, but not exactly. It's not a GLP-1 receptor agonist, but just increases GLP-1 secretion. It's not the same. It definitely doesn't show in studies to contribute to major weight loss or to decrease appetite. So I would say that current evidence suggests berberine is like we'll call it a poor man's metformin, because I think it costs less than metformin, although it likely works via multiple mechanisms. Okay, so assuming that it's more like metformin, how does it work? Just to give you an idea, and this is one of the major theory of how metformin works, is berberine works on the sensor that we have in every cell, and that is a sensor of the cell's way to know how much energy it has. And the energy in our cell is ATP, adenotriphosphate. I remember that from grade 13. ATP is our stored energy. Whether you're eating fats, carbohydrates, or proteins, if you're using them for energy, they're ultimately broken down, burnt as fuel, and stored as ATP, which is energy. That energy is used to do things in the body for many chemical reactions. We can't live without it, not even for seconds. Um, have another sip of water here. So when we are hungry or we're short of fuel, we haven't eaten in a while, the sensor is going to pick that up, and it's going to start to help us to break down fats so that we can release them and burn them for fuel because we need fuel, and also to take up glucose out of the blood so that we can burn it as fuel too. So we go into a mode of burning. So it's sort of like the opposite of what insulin is doing. Insulin wants us to just hold on to energy. And when this sensor goes off, we turn into sort of the opposite mode. So what berberine does is it shifts the energy balance just a little bit in all of our cells. It makes it a little bit harder for us to make that stored energy, thus making the cell think, and getting a little bit of a stressful state. I need fuel, and kicking us into this mode where we are burning fats and taking up glucose more readily. And this is very helpful if you have insulin resistance. And that's how metformin works. We also know that berberine lowers insulin. Um, and who does it do this in? It does those in anyone who's just insulin resistant or who has pre-diabetes, metabolic syndrome, or type 2 diabetes. And as I said, 1 in 5 Canadians is insulin resistant. And the evidence is quite, quite strong, very robust. We have multiple randomized controlled trials and many meta-analyses. So what is the mainstream approach to diabetes? Well, as I mentioned, metformin is one of the most, and I'm talking about type 2 diabetes. Metformin is the most commonly prescribed drug. It helps your liver to better regulate glucose output through the mechanism I just described, and it puts you into that mode more of, thinking that you're hungry or you have low energy so that you start to burn fat. That's why people do lose some weight on metformin, definitely. And that's how I think berberine HCl works for the most part. The other drugs sort of more work on insulin, in raising your insulin levels, either by giving you insulin directly, helping you make more insulin, as these two, including the GLP-1 agonists. Now, ideally, we don't want to make more insulin if we're already insulin resistant. We want to we want to lower our insulin resistance and just take up our blood glucose. So it's ideal when someone has not gone so far off, along the path of diabetes that's poorly controlled, that they don't have to go on to these other drugs. But does berberine help with weight loss? Um, Given that it probably works quite similarly to metformin. Well, this is the evidence. So in people with pre-existing conditions that are related to metabolism, such as type 2 diabetes, polycystic ovarian syndrome, that some women have, which is often related to insulin resistance as well, cardiovascular disease, metabolic syndrome, or this is basically fatty liver. Berberine could potentially induce weight loss. Studies have shown in different ways, reduced BMI, body weight, waist circumference, and waist to hip ratio. But there are few studies in otherwise healthy participants. So if you're, just a healthy person, taking berberine is not likely to change anything with regards to your weight. Now, examine.com, this is where I got this information from, is a fantastic website. It does have a paywall, but it has a group of scientists um, who are not brand focused, so they are neutral, and all they do is evaluate natural health products and tell you the evidence about those products, and they evaluate them, just based on their most of them have PhDs in nutrition. So I do rely on it a lot to get evidence. And I've been using that website for a good probably 6 years. And I will tell you, because I've looked at dozens and dozens and dozens of health products, that it's very rare that they ever talk about a large effect coming from a natural health product. It's almost always moderate. It's also quite rare that they rate the evidence, the highest level of evidence as A. So that's why I say berberine is it's quite solid. So there's A level evidence that there's a large improvement in hemoglobin A1C. Again, that's a measure of our 2 to 3 month glucose levels, as well as blood glucose, and moderate improvement in our total cholesterol. So it really does deserve this. I've got here these fireworks. It's a fantastic natural product to have. Now, I did a little bit of a self study on myself with regards to berberine. And just to explain it here, so for 14 days, I was wearing the glucose monitor, as you see here. And I was testing my blood glucose levels sort of all day, as much as I can every day. And what I did was I took the top 3 highest levels of my blood glucose for 14 days. Then for 2 weeks, I took berberine and I repeated the same process. Now, my disclaimer here would be like this is not a natural way to evaluate your blood glucose in mainstream medicine. It's just how I did it. It was the easiest way that I thought would be helpful for me to compare. Um, and the second thing I want to say before I give you to show you the differences here is that naturopaths I've talked to say that they notice at least you need to be on berberine for 3 months to get really significant results. And also, I have seen studies that saying you get the best results after 10 months of continuous use. So I'm going to expect here that I'm not seeing the full results of what I would have gotten had I used it for a long period of time, but I still noticed a definite significant change and trend towards better levels. Again, and another thing is that I'm not diabetic or even pre-diabetic. I'm just at the very bottom of it at risk, but I still notice a difference. So if my levels were up in the tens, which I really didn't like to see, I put that in red. In orange, if they were in the nines, then I got the eights and sevens. And if I had the lowest levels was in green, in the sixes, which is what I was hoping for, to see more of those. And you can definitely see here, my only 10 after 2 weeks of use was lower than the other two and only occurred once. There's a lot more in the orange here than here, and a lot more in the green. So there's definitely now I don't have the sort of background and take the time to evaluate this to show if it's scientifically statistically significant, but I think it is from at a glance it looks like it to me. So I just thought I would share that. Here is the most recent meta-analysis I could find in 2024 where they looked at 50 studies. All of these are randomized placebo-controlled studies, which included over 4,000 participants to get a really good idea about berberine and how it works either alone or in combination with drugs for a type 2 diabetic. And the overall conclusion was current evidence suggests that berberine alone or in combination has significant potential for treating type 2 diabetes. Now, that's not what it says on the label. It doesn't say it's for type 2 diabetes, and I'm not suggesting one way or another that you should use it. In fact, I think up till now, I've really suggested that we ought to address insulin resistance long before we get to type 2 diabetes. But most of the studies for berberine are on type 2 diabetics. There are some on people who are pre-diabetic as well. So we definitely know it can help that population as well. And if your doctor is interested, I mean, there's possibilities such as maybe lowering the medication you're on and using it in conjunction with berberine, but that's again up to anyone between you and your doctor or your pharmacist to decide. Here's another review before that in 2021, 46 randomized controlled trial, over 4,000 participants. Conclusion: there is strong evidence supporting the clinical efficacy and safety of berberine in the treatment of diabetes, especially as an adjunct therapy, meaning on top of the medication. And the scientists group in examine.com, the website I mentioned, what they had to say about this meta analysis was the usage of berberine in reducing blood glucose, according to a recent meta analysis, is comparable to the oral hypoglycemic drugs metformin, or this is a different one, not as commonly known. This suggests berberine is one of the more effective supplements for blood glucose reductions. I would 100% agree with that. I'd say it's the most effective. So, although the evidence for supplements is never as robust as it is for a drug like metformin, but nevertheless, it does show in some cases, in some studies, to be almost comparable, I would say, to metformin. And especially when I did the research in women or in people of Asian descent, for whatever reason that is. It's not uncommon for drugs to act differently on men or women, but it seems to maybe even have more efficacy in those populations. And lastly, just what I wanted to show you as a snapshot. Now you can take a picture with your phone, or when this training is placed on the YouTube channel of Healthy Planet, you can then just do a screenshot there. It can be complicated and overwhelming to, when you look at the risk information on a supplement, to figure out what does it all mean and does it apply to me. So it does say on the product to consult a healthcare provider before use if, and then it has a list of all these things. If you have low blood pressure, liver disease, diabetes or hypoglycemia, cardiovascular disease, etc. So here I put, at least to the best of my knowledge, explanations elaborating on these, which I got from a natural medicine database. So this is not Health Canada details. It's just the information I've got. That's why I put these statements and explanations have not been evaluated by Health Canada. So, you can take this information, but don't use it as a substitute for talking to your doctor or your pharmacist. And it's contraindicated in pregnancy and breastfeeding, simply because that's pretty much almost across the board for most supplements, but not all, because they haven't been studied in those populations, and we have to be more careful. And that brings me to the end of this hopefully very useful topic. So thank you so much for everybody who has stuck around till now to listen. And I will take questions. So please, if you joined late, I would ask that if you've been writing your questions in the chat, I won't be going through the chat. Please write them in the Q&A area.